Hello everyone, I've built the internet but way smaller in Minecraft. More specifically, I've built 4 computers, so to speak, each one of which is capable of sending images to and receiving and storing images from the other 3 computers completely wirelessly via the use of dispensers filled with arrows and target blocks. So I'll now explain to you how to use these computers, so that you can do whatever you want with them yourself. The world download link is in the description, and then I'll spend the majority of the video talking about the nitty-gritty technical details of how they all actually work. If anyone is wondering why I have firework rockets in my inventory, it's because I also have an elytra equipped, because this whole world is kind of big, and so I personally found it easier to travel between everything by elytra instead of flying normally in creative mode, so I just left the elytra on, left the firework rockets in my inventory in case anyone else would like to do the same thing. Also, please ignore this stuff over here for now. That's for a later part of the video and I will explain it then. One last final thing before I start. This is not a good way of sending information. This is a dumb thing I made because I have too much time. If you want to chat with your friends in Minecraft multiplayer, you're honestly just way better off doing something like this. Trust me. There are 4 of these computers, each one of which has a screen which has 3 segments on it. The bottom segment is somewhat like a paint program. If I press these buttons right here, you can see that the redstone lamps light up. I can also just press these buttons up here, and these 2 redstone lamps will light up. There is a slight delay in them lighting up. However, if I decide I don't like where these redstone lamps are, I can then press these 2 buttons again, and both these redstone lamps will turn off. And I can then press these 2 buttons and light up these 2 redstone lamps. The top 2 segments are somewhat like a scrolling chat log. This middle segment shows the message that was most recently sent to this computer, and this top segment shows the message that was sent before that message. For example, if I were to send a message from one of those computers to this computer, the message that was here would then show up here, while the new message would show up here. And then if I were to send another message, the message that was here would once again get copied up here, and the new message would once again show up here. There are, however, 3 other computers, so we're going to want some way to distinguish between the messages sent by each one, and this is where these 3 buttons come in. If you press this button, then this computer will display the messages sent to it by this computer. If you press the middle one, then this computer will display the messages sent to it by this computer, and if you then press the top one, then this computer will display the messages sent to it by this computer. This chat log works exactly the same with each of the computers as I explained previously. Since we pressed this top button and selected this computer, the most recent message sent to this computer from that computer will show up here, and the message sent before that will show up here. One thing which some of you might have noticed is that when you press one of these buttons, then these top 2 segments do kind of flicker like that. That is just due to how I built it. If you wait long enough, then the actual messages that have been sent from this computer will show up in these 2 segments. The only reason why both of these segments are blank is because this computer hasn't actually sent any images to this computer yet. So we can now view all the messages sent from each of these computers on this computer individually. However, we still can't send any messages to those computers. That is where this button comes in. If you press it, then it will send the image which is currently in this bottom segment to whichever computer is selected. For example, if you had pressed this bottom button and selected that computer, then sent this image right here, then this image would have shown up on the middle segment of this computer, assuming that this computer was viewing messages from this computer, and I'll demonstrate that momentarily. But first I want to explain how the messages are actually sent around between computers. As I mentioned previously, Messages are transmitted between the computers completely wirelessly using dispensers filled with arrows and target blocks. I'll explain how this works in a bit more detail later on, but for now all you need to know is that these dispenser arrays shoot arrows into all of these target blocks and thus transmit data such as what is currently showing on the bottom segment of the screen, as well as the computer which the message needs to get sent to, and the computer which sent the message. The way that those latter bits of information are transmitted, though, is via hard-coded 2-digit binary IP addresses. For example, this computer right here has an IP address of 00, this computer has an IP address of 11, this computer has an IP address of 10, and this computer has an IP address of 01. And the reason I chose binary IP addresses was so that we could just transmit the IP addresses easily with only 2 dispensers. For example, if we want to send a message to 11, which is that computer, then both of these dispensers would fire. If, however, we want to send a message to 10, that computer, then only the top dispenser would fire and the bottom dispenser wouldn't. And if we wanted to send a message to 01, then the top dispenser would not fire, but the bottom dispenser would. And we can then parse that information based on which of these target blocks in this whole big array is hit, and deduce which computer the message needs to be sent to. We also send the IP address of the computer that the message is sent from in exactly the same way with these 2 dispensers up here. For example, because this computer is 00, then neither of these dispensers will fire whenever a message is being sent, so that all of these computers will realize that the message is sent from this computer and parse the data accordingly. Also, this one dispenser down here always fires whenever a message is sent, because it's just a quick and dirty way of finding out whenever a message has been sent to a router or a computer. So, if, for example, this computer wanted to send a message to that computer, the IP address of which is 10, then this dispenser would fire, this dispenser wouldn't, and all of these dispensers would show the message that's been drawn on the bottom segment of that computer screen. They would then all shoot their arrows into this router, which would then look at the data sent by these 2 dispensers and realize that the message needs to be sent to that computer. So it will then activate this dispenser array, activating these repeaters, activating this router. This router will once again realize that the message needs to be sent to that computer, and will activate these dispensers down here, activating these repeaters, activating this router. This router will realize that the message needs to be sent to this computer, and so will activate these dispensers, sending the message into this computer. And so that is how we send messages from computer to computer completely wirelessly. So, if we then press this button down here to make sure that this computer is showing the messages that have been sent from this computer, and we wait for all of the flashing to stop, and then press this button, then this computer will send its message, which is down here, to that computer. So if we go around the back, we can see that the computer has shot message arrows into these target blocks, and if we go around here, we can see that this router knew that it needed to send the message to that computer, so it shot arrows into these target blocks, and these repeaters shot arrows into here, and then down here, this router knew that it needed to send the message into this computer, so it shot arrows into these target blocks. And if we go around here, we can see that that image has been perfectly copied right up here. Then, however, if we decide that we want to send another message to this computer, we can go over here and press these 2 buttons and then activate these 2 buttons just to change the message on the screen slightly. These 2 redstone lamps will turn off and these 2 will turn on. One thing to be careful about is when you write a new message, you should always wait 5 to 10 seconds before sending it, as it can take a little while for the message to travel all the way through these observer chains over here into this dispenser array. I will talk about all of that a little bit later. But now if we go back down here again and press this button again, and once again go around the back, we can see that arrows have been shot into these target blocks. Once again, the router is shooting arrows into these target blocks, and if we go back down here, we should see in a moment that these pistons will activate. I will explain why that is a little bit later, but arrows have been shot into these target blocks, and so if we go all the way back along here, we can see that the message that was just down here has been copied up here, and the new message has been pasted, or rather written, right here. This works in exactly the same way for every single one of these computers. For example, if I just pressed this button and then pressed the send button on this computer, then it would send its message over here. On this computer, if I pressed this bottom button and then pressed the send button, it would send its message over here. And if I pressed, for example, this button and then send button, it would send its message over there to that computer. One last thing that you should know about this, if you're going to be sending a lot of messages from a lot of different computers at the same time, is to be wary of crisscrossing message paths. What I mean by a message path is the path that a message takes. For example, if this computer is sending something to this computer, then the path the message takes goes up here, through there, and down here. So if these two computers are talking, and these two computers are talking, then the message path goes up here, through there, and down there, or up here, through here, and down here. And the message path between these two computers goes up here, through here, down here, or up here, through here, and down here. So those two message paths do not actually cross. If, however, this computer is sending messages to this computer, and this computer is sending messages to this computer, the message path for this computer goes up here, through here, and down here, and the message path for this computer goes up here, through here, and down here, so the two message paths cross right here. This could potentially, if both of the computers sent their message at the exact same time, cause big problems and potentially even cause this whole thing to break. So just be cautious of that if you're playing around with this with friends or anything. That basically does it for all you need to know to use this though. I'll now move on to the more technical details of how this works, starting over here with the dispenser and target block mechanics. This is all quite simple. You have a dispenser filled with arrows, it'll fire an arrow into this target, which is made up of 9 target blocks. At least one of these redstone dust will power, meaning at least one of these repeaters will power, meaning that this redstone line will definitely power, meaning that this output of this whole target will be powered. The reason why you need 9 target blocks in one target is because if I activate this redstone clock right here, you can see that the arrows are fired from the dispenser with some degree of randomness. Like some hit this target block up here, some hit the target block in the middle, and some hit the target block down there. So 9 target blocks are necessary in order to ensure that all the arrows fired from the dispenser hit the target. The reason why these 3 target blocks are pushed out and there are 3 redstone dust here when instead of there just being a completely flat target is because I built this in snapshot 20W15A, in which target blocks were a pain to deal with as they did not conduct redstone power. So the easiest way I could think of getting 1 redstone output from 9 target blocks was to just move these 3 out and place 3 redstone dust in here. Also, the reason why there is a repeater here when I could have just placed 3 redstone dust here and put a repeater here and be done with it is because there is a small chance that an arrow could strike one of these targets, but in such a way that this redstone dot would only be powered to a power level of 1, which would mean that if this repeater wasn't here, this redstone dust could not power this redstone dust, and thus even though an arrow hit the target, the output would not power. So I've put 3 repeaters here, and they all feed into this one repeater, ensuring that if an arrow hits this target anywhere, this output will definitely power. I set up this small device along here to demonstrate what can be done with this. As you can see here, this redstone lamp is unpowered. However, if I go along here and press this button, as you can see, arrows shoot all the way along. Right here, I've just run these 3 repeaters into 3 blocks and put 2 redstone dots here. Once again, because this was built in 20W15A, before all the new stuff with redstone dots got introduced, even though this redstone dot does not physically connect to this dispenser, it will still power it. And as you can see, the arrows just get shot along until it hits this T flip-flop, which powers this redstone lamp. However, as you can see, this whole method of transmitting redstone signals using arrows is really inefficient, as the maximum distance I could get was 9 blocks. For example, if I press this button right here, you can see that all of the arrows hit the target. However, I experimented a bit with moving the targets away and giving them lower elevations, and if I just activate all 3 of these redstone clocks, you will be able to see that some arrows do miss the targets. Not a lot of arrows miss the targets, but still enough miss the targets that it would be generally unwise to use targets which were any further away or any lower. We've actually been getting really insanely lucky. Normally, so many more arrows miss. But as you can see here, 2 arrows have missed. I think 2 from that target, and 1 from that target, and another one, I believe, from that target. This target distance really misses arrows the least. However, I still used this target distance in essentially all of my designs, as it could be counted upon to always intercept an arrow, if you will. In case anyone's wondering what this is, it's a very basic prototype I built to determine the viability of sending messages via arrows and targets. The way it works is you have this screen here. By pressing buttons here, you can determine which of these pixels are lit up. For example, if I press this button and this button, this will turn off and this will turn on. It does take a little bit, as this is a somewhat inefficient version. I'll talk about how it works over there when I'm discussing this circuit. But as you can see, this is lit up and this is turned off. If I press this one again, this redstone lamp will just turn off. And then if you press this wooden button over here, then that message will get sent over here and displayed on this screen. I'm not going to spend any more time talking about this because it's very simple and also doesn't really have much bearing as to the main event, which is right over here. However, if you want to know how it works, you can download the world from the link in the description and have a poke around yourself. The way that this works is very simple. When I press this button, this piston is powered briefly and pushes this observer down here. This observer powers this hopper briefly. That powering is then detected by this observer, which sends a single 1-tick pulse into this sticky piston, causing it to spit out its observer, creating an observer clock with that observer. That signal is then run through observer chains up all the way around back into the screen where this redstone lamp lights up. The reason why this works is because redstone lamps actually visually appear to stay on 1 tick after they are depowered, so you can send a constant stream of 1-tick pulses 1 tick apart into a redstone lamp, and it will appear to stay solidly on. Now if I then press this button again, the exact same will happen, except this time the 1-tick pulse will cause this sticky piston to pull up its observer, breaking the observer clock, meaning that this redstone lamp here will no longer be powered. Also, these buttons are on slabs to prevent this piston, and this piston also powering when I press this button. Now let's talk about the data storage. All of the data is stored in these 3 towers, which I'll call memory towers. each one of which corresponds to one of these computers. For example, this memory tower corresponds to that computer, this middle memory tower corresponds to that computer, and this last memory tower corresponds to that computer. And the data is stored by the position of observers. For example, here we can see that these two observers have been pushed forwards, creating observer clocks here. And if we go down here, we can see that these two redstone lamps have been powered. If we move one row lower, we can see that these three observers have been pushed forwards, and thus if we go over here, we can see that these three redstone lamps are on. There are overall 10 of these rows of observers, each one of which corresponds to a specific row on this. For example, this top row corresponds to this top row of observers, this and this bottom row of redstone lamps corresponds to this bottom row of observers all the way down here. However, it's easier for later if you think of it as 2 units of 5 rows. The bottom 5 rows of which correspond to this image, and the top 5 rows of which correspond to this image. For now, you shouldn't be paying attention to any of this other clutter, as that will all be explained later, and instead you should only be focusing on these observers. So now that we can store the data, we need to find a way to write the data to the screen, and also decide which one of these 3 memory towers we want writing the data to the screen, because if all 3 of them tried to write data to the screen at the same time, then all of the data would just be overlaid and you wouldn't be able to make any sense out of it. And this is where this mass of observers comes in. There are 5 bits of redstone dust here, there's one under there, one right in there, and one right in there. You can't see it, but take my word for it, they are there. And there's one observer on each of these that corresponds to one of those bits of redstone dust. For example, this observer right here, this observer right here, and this observer right here all correspond to this one piece of redstone dust. And there's an observer chain running from each of those observers into this piece of redstone dust. So if any of those observers fires a pulse, then this piece of redstone will be powered for 1 tick. And then there's an observer chain facing it, which is simply just run right down into the screen. So for example, if this observer is pushed forwards and creating an observer clock this observer, then this piece of redstone dust will constantly be flashing on and off, and that is then read by this observer, so this observer chain is constantly flashing on and off, and which means that this redstone lamp will appear to be constantly on. So using this, we can write data from each of these 3 memory towers to the screen. However, this doesn't help us choose which of these 3 memory towers write data to the screen, and that is where these pistons and this blue wool come in. When these pistons are extended, these observers are pushed up and are free to create observer clocks with these observers, and thus this redstone dust flashes on and off. If, however, we break this redstone block and depower these pistons, you can see that the observers have been moved down and cannot create observer clocks with these observers, meaning that this redstone dust is no longer flashing on and off, meaning that this row of observers is no longer writing any data to the screen, and in fact if we come over here we can see that the top row is blank. So this is how we can choose which of these memory towers we want writing information to the screen. However, we still need to make a circuit which switches between each of these. And that is where this comes in. When one of these buttons is pressed, the corresponding blue wool redstone line will be powered, and also this reset circuit will be powered. This reset circuit goes around each of these redstone staircases, providing a pulse long enough for this sticky piston to reach out and pull back its redstone block, depowering this row of pistons, meaning that data will no longer be written from this memory tower to the screen. The dark blue redstone line also goes around, and for example here it causes these sticky pistons to push out but pull back their redstone blocks, and over here it causes these sticky pistons to push out and pull back the redstone blocks. However, depending on which button is pressed, for example if the bottom button is pressed, this redstone line will be powered, and if the top button is pressed, this redstone line will be powered. One of these memory towers will have these pistons pushed back out again, because right here, if the bottom button is pressed, this redstone line will power, activating the small stable circuit, powering this redstone staircase, causing these sticky pistons to spit back out their redstone blocks. And if this middle redstone line is powered, then that will come all the way over here and power this monostable circuit, causing these sticky pistons to spit out the redstone blocks, powering this row of pistons, meaning that if the middle button were pressed, then the middle memory tower would write its data to the screen. However, because of the reset circuit, that would mean that the middle tower would be the only memory tower writing its data to the screen, and this right tower and that left tower would not be writing any data to the screen because their redstone blocks would not be powering this blue wool, and these pistons would be retracted, meaning that observer clocks could not be created here. So we now have a way to store data and to choose which data we want to write to the screen. However, we still don't have a way to change that data. And this is where this comes in. This array of 28 targets is where the arrows will land when a message is sent to this computer. There's a grid of 5x5 targets, which is where the message data lands, one target down here, which is activated whenever a message is sent, and 2 targets up here for determining the IP address of the computer that sent the message. This 5x5 grid of targets is very simple. Whenever an arrow hits this target, this pulse extender activates, and this piston pushes forwards its observer, creating an observer clock, the signal of which is then run through observer chains, down through here, into there, and there, so it's sent to all 3 of the memory towers. However, only one of the memory towers updates the data it contains based on the new message, and which one of the memory towers that is based on this circuit right over here. This is essentially just a collection of logic gates based on if this top redstone line is powered or if this bottom redstone line is powered, because if the message is coming from that computer, the IP address will be 11, and thus this redstone line and this redstone line will be powered. However, if it's coming from that third computer, the address will be 10, so only this top redstone line will be powered and this bottom redstone line won't be. And if it's coming from the third computer, the address will be 01, where this top redstone line won't be powered, but this bottom redstone line will be. And thus we can use these logic gates to find out which of the computers sent the message. These logic gates are very simple. Here, I just have a redstone torch here, which I'm running this redstone line and this redstone line into. So if either of these is powered, this redstone torch will shut off and this will no longer give an output. The reason why this isn't connected to anything is because this is the logic gate for 00, which is the IP address of this computer. And since this computer isn't going to be sending anything to itself, it isn't necessary to connect this one up to anything. Over here, this is the logic gate for 11, so if both of these redstone lines are powered, both of these torches will turn off, meaning that this torch can turn on, giving an output here. These two logic gates are essentially the same, however, this one codes for 10 and this codes for 01. Right here, if this top one is powered but this bottom one isn't, then this redstone torch will depower, causing this piston to pull up, meaning that this repeater will power as this redstone line will power this block, and this repeater can just take the power out of that block and will power itself. This is completely the same, however, I simply moved this redstone line down here and moved this redstone line up here because I was having some difficulties with just flipping this around. These things right here are just pulse extenders, because when I was trying to run normal pulse extenders just in line with this redstone line, I was running into issues with pulse strengths and this and these redstone dust becoming unpowered, even though this pulse extender was still powered. So I came up with this solution. When this redstone line is powered, these repeaters will power this pulse extender, and this pulse extender will then run that power right back into this redstone line. However, they'll also run power into this piston, causing it to push its block forwards, meaning that this repeater will no longer be powering this pulse extender. And there's enough delay on these repeaters that this piston will stay extended for long enough that when this pulse extender shuts off, it won't simply get powered again by these repeaters, starting the cycle all over. And that was how I lengthened the pulse of this redstone line while maintaining each of these redstone dust at constant power. This was just copied right over here, but rotated slightly for the redstone line on the bottom. This mass of repeaters and pulse extenders down here, though, does something slightly different, as these two redstone lines do their own thing, but that can only happen once I'm sure that all the errors fit the target and thus all the information has been transferred. So this acts as sort of delay, keeping this repeater from powering until after this pulse extender has depowered. When this redstone line powers, it powers this pulse extender, which keeps this redstone line powered for a little bit longer. It also powers this unstable circuit, which causes this sticky piston to spit out its block to right here, so that this repeater cannot power its block as it's out of the way, meaning that this repeater will not get powered. This unstable circuit also powers this pulse extender, which powers this sticky piston as long as the pulse extender is active, so that when the pulse extender shuts off, the sticky piston will pull back its block, so that now after a short delay, the signal will be able to travel through this block and into this repeater, so that both of these redstone lines will be powered. The reason why this unstable circuit also powers this piston is because it takes too long for the signal to just travel through this pulse extender and then into this piston, so it was easier to just make this piston spit out its block and then power for more than one tick. Also, the reason why this pulse extender is set to a longer tick delay is because it also took a couple of ticks for the signal to go into this sticky piston from the unstable circuit, so setting the repeater to a longer tick delay ensures that no ticks of power cross through over this block into this repeater. When this redstone line is powered, it goes all the way up here and powers these three pistons, causing them to push the blocks down. One of these three repeaters will be powered depending on which computer the message came from, and thus one of these three redstone lines will be powered, each one of which runs off to a specific memory tower. For example, this redstone line runs off to that memory tower, this redstone line runs off to the middle memory tower, and this third redstone line runs off to that memory tower. This, incidentally, is why only one of the memory towers processes the new information, despite all of the new information having been sent via these observer chains to all three of them. For example, if a message were to be sent from that computer, its IP address is 11, so an arrow would go into each of these targets. Both of these redstone lines will be powered, and this repeater will be powered. Then after a while, when this redstone line activated, these pistons would push down, and this repeater would be powered, because that repeater would be powered, and then the signal would be run all the way down through here, and all the way into here, and it would power this circuit, which takes care of copying the information from the bottom 5 rows to the top 5 rows, and then copying the new message onto the bottom 5 rows. This circuit overall does 4 things. It deletes the data in the top 5 rows, copies the data in the bottom 5 rows to the top 5 rows, deletes the data in the bottom 5 rows, and copies the new message onto the bottom 5 rows. So first of all, to delete the data in the top 5 rows, the redstone signal travels all the way up here, up this staircase, and here into this unstable circuit with the repeater coming out of it set to 3 ticks. This causes these pistons to push forwards and pull back, pulling back all of these observers, essentially deleting all the data in the top 5 rows. Then after 4 ticks of delay, this unstable circuit with this repeater activates, causing these pistons to be pushed up for 4 ticks. Now, these observer chains here flash on and off based on the data that the bottom row is holding. For example, as you saw up there, these two observers are flashing on and off, and if we go down to the bottom row right here, you can see that these two observers are right here. If we go up one higher, we can see that these three observers are up here, and if we go to the second row up here, you can see that these three observers are flashing on and off. So when these pistons push up, these blocks get powered based on if this is flashing or not, and then these repeaters are then powered by that block. The reason why they're set to this tick duration is because, I'll demonstrate right now, this is flashing on and off. Let me just break that to prevent it from breaking this whole thing. This observer is flashing on and off, and if I place a block in here, then you can see that this observer at the end stays constantly on. So that is just why they're set to those specific tick durations. So when these pistons power, they push their blocks up, powering these repeater lines, which then feed into this one-stable circuit and send one tick pulse to these pistons, causing them to spit out their observers based on the condition of the observers down here. For example, if there are these two observers right here, when they're updated via this one-stable circuit and this redstone line, they will spit out these two observers right here. Also, just to clarify quickly, the bottom 5 rows and the top 5 rows do hold different information. The only reason why there are two observers pushed out here and also two observers pushed down there is not because they're both holding the same information, but because both messages had those 2 pixels activated on the bottom rows. That, however, is pretty much all the stuff that goes on up here. If we move down here, we can see that this redstone line then feeds into these two monostable circuits with a little bit of delay to make sure that all of this happens after all of this has happened, because otherwise data could be copied to the top 5 rows, which wasn't necessarily a perfect copy of the bottom 5 rows. The first thing that happens down here is this monostable circuit is powered. It's just like the reset circuit up there. It pushes these pistons forwards and then pulls it back, deleting the data which they hold. And then, after a couple ticks of delay, this monostable circuit is activated, sending out a 1-tick pulse. I did something a bit different here as to what I did up here, because it takes some time for all of the signals to travel through these long observer chains, and also given that I wasn't really timing the various events so much, so to speak, I had a little bit more leeway in what I could do down here. So when this monostable circuit fires, all of these pistons spit their blocks up right here. And then this dispenser is also powered, however I'll come to that in a minute. Then, since all of these observers flash on and off based on the data contained in the message, if, for example, this block is here and this observer is flashing on and off, then these powered rails will be powered. This powered rail right here will update this piston, causing it to realize it's being powered via quasi-connectivity. Because this block is powered, it will push down, updating this piston, causing this piston to remember that it's being powered by quasi-connectivity, which is this block, causing this piston to pull up and pull its block right back down. This observer also sends a 1-tick pulse to this piston whenever this turns on, and during all of that piston shenanigans, this will only turn on once. So a single 1-tick pulse will be sent to this piston if this observer is flashing on and off repeatedly. This circuit only really works properly, however, if the observers start flashing after this piston has spit its block up here. And that is where this circuit comes in. Because these observer chains running from the target to the middle memory tower are quite short. It doesn't take a lot of time for the information to travel through them, so usually these observers started flashing on and off before these pistons stuck their blocks out, which is causing some problems. So I created this circuit. All that it does is delay when these observers start flashing on and off, because as you can see, when it's deactivated, these pistons aren't extended, and thus, if these observers coming straight from the target start flashing, they'll just be flashing into air. However, when these pistons are powered and push up, then these repeaters will also start flashing, and these observers then realize that, and then these observers start flashing. This redstone line just comes right out of here and has quite a few repeaters set up here, all set to 4 ticks, just to ensure that this circuit has enough time to activate and that these pistons extend their blocks before the observers start flashing and the message comes through. The reason why this circuit is only right here on the middle memory tower is that these observer lines coming around here are long enough that these pistons have plenty of time to spit out their blocks before all the observers start flashing on and off. And the same is true for the other side, as it also has very long observer chains coming around here. This piston and these observers are essentially a copy of these pistons and these observers. These pistons are reset by the exact same circuit as these pistons, and when this observer detects that this powered rail has been powered on and off again, then it will send a 1-tick pulse to this piston, causing it to spit out its block and create an observer clock with this observer. That's then run through an observer chain all the way up and right into here. That's how we know what data the bottom 5 rows are holding. The purpose of this massive orange wool is essentially to act as a timer to make these pistons extend and pull back their blocks after a certain amount of time, because when this one-stable circuit is activated, these blocks will be up like this, and if this observer flashes on and off, then this piston will pull its block back up. But if this observer doesn't flash on and off, then this block will remain here. So this timer essentially acts to make all the pistons pull their blocks down there, essentially resetting all of this, but not the data stored in this bottom section of the tower after a certain period of time. The way it works is very simple. When this redstone line is powered, it powers this dispenser, causing it to drop its redstone dust. Entities travel much more slowly through cobwebs. For example, if I drop this cobweb here and chuck this red wool in, you can see that it travels through this very slowly. So after a long period of time, that redstone dust will be at the bottom of this cobweb and will be picked up by this hopper. We then take an output from that, which is longer than 1 tick, and send that right up into here, causing these pistons to push out their blocks and retract it. That signal, however, is also sent through here, through a bit of delay into this dispenser, because the redstone dust will have been ferried into it after 6 ticks, and then it just sends it up this item elevator, which is basically just an entire mass of orange wool. It's very, very old school, and that is then delivered into this water stream, which flows over this hopper, which delivers the redstone dust right back down here. So it's a completely reusable timing system. And that's all we need to talk about concerning the reception of messages. The last thing we need to talk about concerning this whole computer build is the actual sending of messages from this computer to another. When this button is pressed, this redstone line powers, going all the way up here, powering this pulse extender, and running up this redstone staircase, going all the way along here, and powering these pistons. And I will explain what the pistons do in a moment. However, first you should know that the redstone line just runs straight into this dispenser right here, because this dispenser always fires whenever a message is being sent. These observer lines right here carry the message which is currently displayed on this screen right there, all the way up into here and around into these dispensers, so that when this piston is activated, it will put its block up here, and if this particular observer is flashing on and off, then this block will be powered and these repeaters will also be powered. As you remember, these timings of these repeaters are done in such a way that if this observer is flashing on and off, this repeater will stay constantly on. So this redstone dust will only turn on once, meaning that only one arrow will be shot out of this dispenser. As you can see right here, the observers which are flashing on and off correspond to the message on screen. So when all of these pistons are activated, a perfect representation of what's on the screen will appear on these 25 target blocks, where a target with an arrow in it is an unlit lamp, and a target with an arrow in it is a lit lamp. These two dispensers here transmit the IP address of the computer which the message was sent from. For example, this computer is 00, so neither of these will activate. If I go over here, you can see that as the address of this computer is 11, both of these sticky pistons have redstone block on them, so when this redstone line is powered, they will stick the redstone blocks forwards, powering this dispenser once, causing it to shoot out one arrow into these targets. These two dispensers here are a little different, as they send the information of which computer this computer wants to send the message to. For example, since this computer is reading data from that memory tower, the one on the far right, is reading the data sent from this computer. So if this computer were to send a message, it would send a message to this computer right here. And since the IP address of this computer is 11, both of these repeaters are powered, and if these two pistons were to be powered, which they would be when that button to send a message was pressed, these redstone dots would power and one arrow would be shot from each of these dispensers. And the way that we work out the IP address of which it's sending to is very simple. Right over here there are 3 redstone lines, each one linking up to one of these memory towers. And they all link up to this redstone block right here in the memory tower. Since these redstone blocks are only pushed out when the computer is reading data from this memory tower, for example, it's reading data from this memory tower, so the redstone blocks are pushed out, but it's not reading data from this memory tower, so the redstone blocks are not pushed out, we can run a redstone line from each of them, and that redstone line will tell us if the computer is reading data from its specific memory tower. For example, we are reading data from that memory tower, so this redstone line is powered. If we were to be reading data from this memory tower, this redstone line would be powered and exactly the same for over here. Each one of them then runs into sort of a reverse of what we have down here. For example, since this redstone line is running from that memory tower, and so if we're reading data from that memory tower, that means we want to send a message to that computer. This redstone line then runs into here, which powers both of these redstone lines, which run into these 2 redstone lines, which power these repeaters. This is exactly the same for these other 2 redstone lines. For example, when this one is powered from the middle tower, that means we want to send a message to that 3rd computer over there, so it just runs its redstone line right through here into the top one. So this repeater will be powered, but this repeater would not be powered, so only this dispenser would shoot out an arrow, since the IP address for that 3rd computer is 10. This is also exactly the same for this last redstone line. It just runs into this redstone line powering only this repeater, so that only an arrow would be shot into this target, because the IP address of that very last computer is 01. That is all that we need to talk about concerning this little computer. It's just being copied 4 times along here, so all 4 of these are exactly the same, except for 2 small differences. Because each of these memory towers corresponds to a different computer, for example, on this computer, that memory tower corresponds to this computer, but on this computer, this memory tower corresponds to that computer, because this memory tower could not correspond to this computer, because this computer is not going to be sending in any information to itself. So right here, this redstone line just leads off into nothing, because if we want to send a message to that computer, we want to have no arrows fired out of either of these because the IP address of that computer is 00. This is the same on both of those computers, and also the logic gates here are wired up slightly differently. For example, here 00 is a viable computer that information can be coming from, so that is just run off into this redstone line. But here 11 is not a viable computer that information can be sent to, since this computer is 11 and it cannot send information to itself, so this just runs into nothing. This is exactly the same on both of these computers, because here 00 and 11 are viable computers that information can be sent from, but 10 is not, so this just leads off into nothing. And here, I'm sure you already know, but this just leads off into nothing because 01 is not a viable computer that information can be sent from, as it cannot send information to itself. The last things which we need to talk about are the routers, which are actually in charge of routing the information from one computer to another. Each one of them is capable of sending information in 3 directions: sideways to the left, for example, from this router to that router, sideways to the right, for example, from this router to that router, and forwards to its computer, for example, from this router to this router. They are also all capable of receiving information from those directions. For example, this router can receive information from that router, and this router. Just ignore these bits in between the router target arrays and dispenser arrays. They are just repeaters, so that when an arrow hits this target, this dispenser fires an arrow into this target, because this method of message transmission is actually so inefficient that you need a repeater right in the middle to cross this short distance. One thing, however, to note is that I use 2 different router designs, as for routers to be able to pass information between them and also receive information between them, they need a target array and a dispenser array on one side. So the easiest way I found to do that and maintain router-to-router communication was to have the target array on top and dispenser array on the bottom on one side, and on the other side the dispenser array on the top and the target array on the bottom. So on this router, the 2 targets are at the top and the 2 dispenser arrays are at the bottom, but on this router, the 2 dispenser arrays are at the top and the 2 target arrays are at the bottom. So all of the routers just fit together a bit like a puzzle. One thing which we need to talk about briefly, however, is the orientation in which we send the messages, if that makes any sense. For example, if you connected this target up to that dispenser, and then that target up to that dispenser down there, then the image will get flipped completely horizontally. So what you saw on this computer would be what you saw on this computer, but flipped horizontally, and we don't want that. So instead, we connect this target to that dispenser, and then that target to that dispenser, ensuring that what you see on the screen of that computer is exactly the same as what you saw on the screen of that computer. One thing about this, however, is it does cause the side which the IP address information is transmitted on to be changed. For example, as you can see here, all the IP address information is transmitted on the right side of this whole dispenser array. However, when you're sending a message this way, all of that IP address information is transmitted along this side, and all of the message information is transmitted over here. This is also exactly the same if you're sending a message this way, where all the IP address information is transmitted along here, and all the message information is transmitted along here with these dispensers here. That basically does it, though, for things which you need to know to understand how this works. So we'll begin talking about the actual router designs. We'll start with this router design with 3 targets on the top and the dispensers on the bottom, as it's the easiest to explain. The easiest way to get this to work was just to connect these 2 target arrays into this target array. For example, if this target was hit, then this pulse extender would power. If this target was hit, then this pulse extender would power. And over here on the other side, if this target was hit, this pulse extender would power. And if this target was hit, then this target right over here would power. The way I did this was quite simple. If this target was hit, then this piston would push forward its observer, creating an observer clock, which would then be run through an observer chain into these two repeaters, which would provide a constant pulse to this pulse extender, which would then power this piston pushing forwards its observer, creating an observer clock with this observer, which would then be run off via long observer chains to these three dispenser grids, which I'll talk about briefly later. This is also exactly the same here. For example, this observer chain would power if this target were hit, and that would then be run all the way off into this target. Some of you may have noticed, however, that that observer chain was run off into the second target in the line, when in fact it was the first observer in the line. This is because it is technically the first observer in the line, it's not the first target in the line. These three targets here don't have observers on them because they just run directly over here into the nerve center of the router, which decides which information gets sent to where. If we go over here, we can also see that these three targets also run via redstone lines into the nerve center. The reason why these are the only targets to be run via redstone into the nerve center is because they are the only targets that contain something which the nerve center needs to know, because this target contains whenever a message has been sent, and these two targets contain the IP address which the message needs to get sent to. These two targets up here, even though they carry IP address information, they only carry the IP address of the computer which the message was sent from, which the nerve center does not need to know, so they are just run by observer line into these two targets as normal. And it's exactly the same over here. These two targets are run by observer instead of redstone. So we have a way of receiving information, but we still don't have a way of sending the information back out. That is where the nerve center comes in. It's very similar to this down here. It just has the delayed redstone pulse circuit here and the two pulse extender circuits here, along with the logic gates kind of sandwiched into the middle. The reason, if you're wondering why I just put this piston here with a slime block, is because I was running into some issues with it not depowering when this redstone line depowered. So I just moved it up one block, and that seemed to fix the problem. One difference in these logic gates up here, though, from these logic gates down here, is that all four of them run into something, because this router can send and receive information from 4 computers, instead of just being able to send and receive information from 3. The way that this router actually routes information around, though, is also very simple. These two are the logic gates for 1, 0 and 0, 1, those computers over there. So if either of them activate, and thus if either of these repeaters activate, that means that the message needs to be sent to 0, 1 or 1, 0, which are both to the right. So this redstone line is powered when these pistons come down, because they're powered by this delay circuit. And that is, the redstone signal is then sent all the way down here into this pulse extender, and into this redstone staircase with these pistons right here. This is exactly the same setup as we have up there with the repeaters and redstone dust and observers. And I'll talk about where the observers actually get their information from briefly. The router, however, does the same thing for those two dispenser arrays, as if we come over here, this is the logic gate for 1, 1. So if this repeater is activated, then it must mean that the message needs to be sent to 1, 1, which is right there. So this redstone line powering this pulse extender and all of these pistons. And once again, if we come up here and this is activated, then this means that the message needs to be sent to 0, 0, which is over there. So when this piston comes down, this redstone line is activated. It goes all the way over here and down here into this redstone staircase and pulse extender. Some of you might be thinking why I had to bring the redstone signal all the way down here again. It's because you can't send redstone signals downwards through redstone staircases. So the simplest way I could get of powering all of these redstone lines was to just bring this redstone line down here and then send it back up again. The way that the data is sent to each of the dispenser arrays is also very simple. Because all of the data will be routed to the center target array, regardless of if the message came in from that way, this way, or from the computer, we can just route all of that data to each one of the dispenser arrays. For example, if this pulse extender is powered, it will push forwards this observer, creating an observer clock down there, and we can then just run that signal into this observer, this observer, and this observer. However, the message is only sent one way because only one of these three circuits is actually activated, and that all depends on which way the message needs to get sent. So even though we're sending the information to each three of the dispenser arrays, we're only actually sending the information to one other router or computer. Also, just to make sure that you understand, all of these other targets along here with pulse extenders are also powering these pistons, creating observer clocks, which are also being run off into all of these dispenser arrays, so that the full message is delivered to each dispenser array. Also, one last thing, since the target computer's IP address does need to be sent via the dispenser arrays, and the targets that actually receive the destination computer's IP address don't have any observers or pistons attached to them, these observers and pistons are just located right here. As you can see, they're powered by these redstone lines, which are powered by these targets, and also these targets and those two targets right over there, which you can't see. And then that signal is then just run off into these dispenser arrays. That then basically does it for this router design, so we'll now move on to this router design, which is basically mostly the same as this router design, but with a couple of differences. For example, it has 2 nerve center logic gate areas instead of just 1. The reason why I put in 2 nerve centers was so that I didn't have to route long redstone lines all the way around the place, because here these 3 targets can just run into this nerve center, and these 3 targets can also run into that nerve center, whereas up here these 3 targets can run into this nerve center, so I think it just simplifies things a bit. The various activating of the dispenser arrays in this router is actually much simpler than this router, however, as in this router it's right on the edge of the network, so you don't need to worry about sending information to the left or taking in information from the left. So we can be completely sure that if a message is coming in to this target array, it will need to go into this computer. So as you can see, we just have one redstone line running off into this dispenser array, and if a message comes into that target array, we can be sure that it will need to go this way, so we can just straight away send it into this target array, because as you can see, there's only one redstone line actually running out of all 4 of these logic gates. It isn't really as simple as that for this router though, because despite this router being essentially nearly identical to this router, it is placed right in the middle of the network. So as you can see, all the redstone activation lines run all over the place to each of the 3 different dispenser arrays. That actually also brings me along to a small note about that router over there. The reason why I bothered routing all the observers around so that all the observer lines ran to each of the dispenser arrays, even though only 2 of these dispenser arrays were ever going to be used, is because I wanted to just be able to copy and paste it over here, and I wanted this router to work just as well without having to redo any observer lines. While we're on the subject of routing observer lines, let's talk about these observer lines, as they're also quite simple. When this target is activated, it causes this observer clock to be created. That signal is then run all the way over into this circuit. There are 30 of these circuits, and each one corresponds to a specific target on each target array, much in the same way how both of these targets are just collapsed, if you will, onto this one target. So if one of these target arrays is activated, then this array of pulse extenders will be activated in just the same way, except down here that's only for 2 target arrays, as the third one would be a bit difficult to reach as it's all the way up there. Each one of these circuits then activates this piston, which creates an observer clock, the signal from which is first of all run off into this dispenser array. However, it's not activated as it needs to be activated by this redstone signal. The signal is also run all the way up through these observer chains into these bits of redstone dust. There's also an observer facing them, so that when they're flashing on and off, then these observer chains are activated and they are just run off into all of the dispenser arrays. This is so that both of these targets can send information to all 3 of the dispenser arrays. This target array is also very simple. When these targets are activated and these pulse extenders are activated, they push forwards observers, creating observer clocks which just run into these bits of redstone dust, the same bits of redstone dust that these observer lines run into. So this target array can then send information to both of these dispenser arrays. The reason why there aren't any observer lines going downwards is because these targets don't need to send any information to this dispenser array, because if it did, then this computer would be able to send information to itself, which it obviously can't do or shouldn't be able to do, so there's no reason for this target to be able to send information to this dispenser array. I have one last thing I want to clarify quickly. Yes, the nerve centers in each of the routers have been wired up slightly differently. For example, this router right here recognizes that for it to send a message to 10, which is that computer there, it needs to activate this dispenser array, sending the message over here. This router over here, though, despite it being of the same design as that router, recognizes that due to its place in the network, it needs to activate this dispenser array right here to send the message over here so that it can then be sent into the computer. So there you go. That is how I built the internet, albeit much smaller, in Minecraft. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.